Welcome, dear listener, to tonight's journey into wonder. Before we begin, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, settle into your pillows, let your breathing slow, and prepare to drift into this journey with me tonight. Once upon a time, in a cozy little apartment on the corner of Maple Street, there lived a small orange tabby cat named Whiskers. Now, settle in comfortably, dear listener, and let me tell you about an extraordinary journey that began on the most ordinary of days. Whiskers was not like other house cats. While his neighbours were content with sunny windowsills and afternoon naps, Whiskers spent his days pressed against the glass, watching nature documentaries on the television his owner left playing. He watched cheetahs sprint across golden plains. He watched tigers prowl through emerald jungles. But most of all, he watched lions. Magnificent, powerful, fearless lions with their glorious manes catching the wind. Night after night, Whiskers would dream of being a lion. He would imagine himself stalking through tall grass, his roar echoing across the savannah, every creature looking upon him with awe and respect. He was tired of being small. He was tired of being timid. He was tired of hiding under the couch whenever the doorbell rang. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted the walls in shades of pink and gold, Whiskers made a decision that would change his life forever. His owner had left the window open just a crack just wide enough for a determined little cat to squeeze through. He stood on the windowsill, his heart hammering in his chest like a tiny drum. The world outside looked so vast, so different from the safety of his apartment. For a moment, doubt crept in like a shadow, but then he thought of those lions, and something stirred deep within him, a small spark of courage he did not know he possessed. With a leap that felt both terrifying and exhilarating, Whiskers launched himself into the great unknown. The morning air was cool and filled with unfamiliar scents. Birds chirped overhead in languages he barely understood. The ground beneath his paws was rough and real in a way that carpet had never been. Whiskers took a deep breath, puffed out his small chest, and began walking south toward the wild places he had only seen on television. The city was a jungle of its own. Tall buildings reached toward the sky like concrete trees, and rivers of cars flowed through streets with a constant roar. Whiskers navigated through alleys and across busy intersections, his small size proving useful as he slipped through spaces no larger creature could manage. By midday, he found himself in the heart of downtown, where glass towers reflected clouds and crowds of people rushed past without looking down. Whiskers felt smaller than ever. He began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. That's when he saw it. a poster in a travel agency window, a magnificent lion staring out at the world with golden eyes, surrounded by the wide expanse of an African savannah. The text read, "Find your wild side." Whiskers pressed his nose to the glass. That lion looked so confident, so powerful, so completely unlike the trembling little cat he saw reflected beside it. But beneath his fear, that small spark of courage glowed a little brighter. He would find that savannah. He would become that lion. Bedtime painted the sky in purples and oranges. Whiskers found himself in an old junkyard at the edge of the city. Rusted cars and forgotten appliances created mountains of metal and mystery. He was hungry, tired, and beginning to doubt whether courage was something a house cat could truly possess. A sound stopped him in his tracks. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Whiskers froze, every instinct screaming at him to run. From behind a broken refrigerator emerged the largest dog he had ever seen. A Great Dane with grey fur and eyes that held a lifetime of experience. The dog studied Whiskers with an expression that was neither aggressive nor welcoming, simply curious. Whiskers wanted to flee, wanted to hide, wanted to disappear. But instead, he remembered the lions, and he sat down, keeping his gaze steady despite the trembling in his legs. The Great Dane tilted his massive head. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly gentle, like distant thunder before a summer rain. The dog settled down on his haunches, and Whiskers realized that this creature, who could have ended their encounter in seconds, had chosen kindness instead. They sat together as the stars began to emerge, and the Great Dane shared stories of his youth, of days when he lived in a fighting ring, when people tried to make him vicious, when fear and anger were the only languages he knew. But then, the dog explained, he was rescued. A small child had been crying in the shelter, frightened of all the barking dogs. The Great Dane had simply laid down and rested his enormous head on his paws, making himself as gentle and unthreatening as possible. The child's tears had stopped. The child had smiled. That moment, the dog told Whiskers, was when he understood that true strength was not about being the biggest or the loudest or the most feared. True strength was about choosing to be gentle when you could choose to be fierce. It was about making others feel safe rather than making them feel small. Whiskers listened with his whole heart, and something shifted inside him, a tiny seed of understanding taking root. The next morning, Whiskers continued his journey with the Great Dane's words echoing in his mind. He travelled beyond the city limits, where buildings gave way to trees and concrete transformed into earth. The forest welcomed him with shadows and whispers, with the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. He had been walking for hours when he came upon a stream, its water crystal clear and singing over smooth stones. Whiskers was so focused on quenching his thirst that he did not notice the fox watching him from the opposite bank. The fox was sleek and red as autumn leaves, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence. When Whiskers finally noticed her, he jumped back, his fur standing on end. He had seen foxes on television too, clever hunters, quick and cunning. But the fox only laughed, a sound like wind chimes dancing in the breeze. She introduced herself as Scarlet, and she asked Whiskers what a house cat was doing so far from home. Whiskers, feeling both embarrassed and determined, explained his quest to become a lion. Scarlet tilted her head, considering this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she asked Whiskers a question that caught him completely off guard. Had he ever noticed that lions often went hungry while foxes rarely did? Whiskers admitted he had not thought about that. Scarlet explained that it was not about being the biggest predator or the most powerful. It was about being honest with yourself, about knowing your strengths and your limitations, about working with the world rather than trying to dominate it. Foxes thrived because they were honest about what they were. They did not pretend to be wolves or try to challenge bears. They knew themselves, and in that knowledge, they found their own form of courage. She told him about the time she encountered a hunter's trap. Instead of panicking or trying to force her way free, she had assessed the situation honestly. She had called out, not with pride, but with genuine need, and a passing hiker had heard her cries and freed her. Sometimes, Scarlet explained, courage meant being honest enough to ask for help. Whiskers had never considered honesty as a form of bravery. He had always thought courage meant never showing fear, never admitting weakness. But as he watched Scarlet drink from the stream, so comfortable in her own copper-colored skin, he realized there was a kind of courage in acceptance, in being truthfully, wholly yourself. Days passed as Whiskers journeyed through the forest and began climbing into the foothills. The air grew thinner and cooler. Pine trees stretched toward a sky so blue it seemed impossible. His paws were sore and his stomach often empty, but the spark of courage inside him had grown into a small, steady flame. He was navigating a narrow mountain path when he heard a cry, high-pitched and desperate. Following the sound, Whiskers discovered a small rabbit caught in a tangle of thorny bushes. The rabbit's eyes were wide with terror, and it struggled against the thorns, only making its situation worse. For a moment, Whiskers thought about continuing on his journey. After all, lions probably did not stop to help rabbits. Lions were predators, powerful and focused on their own survival. But then he thought of the Great Dane choosing gentleness, and he thought of Scarlet's honesty, and he knew what he had to do. Carefully, patiently, Whiskers used his small paws and sharp eyes to work at the thorns. He moved slowly, talking softly to the rabbit, keeping his voice calm even when thorns pricked his own paws. It took a long time, much longer than simply walking past would have taken. But eventually, the rabbit was free. The rabbit, whose name was Clover, was so grateful that tears glistened in her large brown eyes. She asked Whiskers where he was heading, And when he explained his quest to become a lion, something unexpected happened. Clover did not laugh. She did not question. Instead, she looked at him with something that looked remarkably like respect. Clover told him that her grandfather lived in the grasslands beyond the mountains, vast open spaces where, if rumors were true, real wild cats sometimes roamed. She offered to guide him there, repaying his kindness with knowledge and companionship. As they traveled together over the next few days, Clover shared stories of her family. She spoke of how rabbit warrens protected not just rabbits, but countless other small creatures who needed refuge. She explained how her people served as early warning systems for entire ecosystems, their awareness and sensitivity keeping many animals safe from danger. Whiskers realized that even the most vulnerable creatures had their own forms of courage. The courage to be watchful, the courage to care for their community, the courage to survive in a world full of larger, stronger beings. Courage, he was beginning to understand, wore many faces. When Whiskers and Clover finally emerged from the mountains, the sight before them took Whiskers' breath away. The grasslands stretched out like an ocean of gold, rippling in the wind beneath an endless sky. This was it, the savannah of his dreams, or at least something very much like it. Clover led him to her grandfather's warren, where dozens of rabbits lived in an intricate system of burrows. The elder rabbit, whose fur was more grey than brown, welcomed Whiskers with surprising warmth. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson and amber, the old rabbit told Whiskers stories of the wild cats who sometimes passed through these lands. But the stories were not what Whiskers had expected. The elder rabbit did not speak of terrifying predators or fearsome hunters. Instead, he told of a wildcat mother who had moved her den 3 times to avoid disturbing a family of ground squirrels. He spoke of a lynx who had shared his hunting grounds with a family of foxes during a harsh winter. He told of a mountain lion who had protected an injured deer from other predators until the deer could walk again, then simply walked away. The elder rabbit looked at Whiskers with eyes clouded by cataracts, but clear with wisdom. He explained that the truly great predators, the ones who survived the longest, who raised the healthiest families, who were remembered in rabbit stories with respect rather than just fear, were those who understood that the strength of the ecosystem was their own strength. They were powerful, yes, but they used that power with discernment. They protected rather than simply destroyed. That night, as Whiskers curled up in a warm corner of the warren, surrounded by the gentle breathing of sleeping rabbits, he dreamed not of being a lion, but of being himself, a small cat on a big journey, learning what courage truly meant. On his 3rd morning on the plains, Whiskers set out alone, wanting to explore this landscape he had travelled so far to see. The grass was tall enough to hide him completely, and he felt a thrill of excitement as he stalked through it, imagining himself as the powerful predator he had always wanted to be. Then the grass ahead of him moved, and Whiskers froze. A cat emerged, but not a house cat. This was a genuine wildcat, probably a feral who had been born in these grasslands. She was lean and muscled, her fur marked with subtle stripes that made her nearly invisible in the golden grass. Her eyes were sharp and alert, missing nothing. Whiskers felt terror surge through him. This was a real wildcat, a true hunter. He was suddenly painfully aware of his soft domestic paws, his well-fed frame, his complete lack of survival skills. But then he remembered the Great Dane choosing to be gentle. He remembered Scarlet's honest assessment. He remembered freeing Clover from the thorns. And instead of running or trying to puff himself up into something he was not, Whiskers simply sat down and spoke his truth. He told the wildcat about his journey. He explained his dream of becoming a lion and how that dream had led him far from the safety of his home. He admitted his fear and his confusion, and how courage had turned out to be something completely different from what he had imagined. The wildcat listened without interrupting. When Whiskers finished, she sat down as well, her tail curling around her paws. She introduced herself as Sage, and she told Whiskers her own story. Sage had been born wild, yes, but that did not make her fearless. Every day was a challenge. Every night held dangers. She had to hunt for every meal, had to stay constantly alert, had to be ready to flee or fight at a moment's notice. But she had also learned that survival was not about being the strongest or the most aggressive. Sage had discovered that the animals who lived longest on these plains were those who knew when to hunt and when to wait. They were those who understood the balance of the ecosystem, who did not take more than they needed, who moved with the seasons, who respected the territories of others. The truly courageous ones, Sage explained, were those who could control their impulses, who could show restraint even when they had the power to take more. She told Whiskers about a time she had tracked a wounded bird, easy prey that would have made a simple meal. But as she approached, she had seen the bird's nest. 3 baby birds, still too young to fly, who would die without their mother. Sage had walked away hungry that day. It was one of the hardest things she had ever done, and no one had witnessed it. There was no reward, no recognition, but she knew in her deepest self that it was right. That, Sage told Whiskers, was courage, doing the right thing, even when it was difficult, even when no one was watching, even when it cost you something. Whiskers felt something break open in his chest, like a door he had not known was locked. He had traveled all this way, thinking courage was about becoming something else, something bigger, fiercer, more powerful. But courage, he was finally beginning to understand, was about becoming more fully yourself, but the best version of that self. It was about choosing kindness over convenience, honesty over pretense, compassion over cruelty. That afternoon, the sky began to change. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, heavy and ominous. The wind picked up, bending the grass in waves and carrying the scent of rain. Sage immediately tensed, her ears flattening against her head. Storms on the open plains were dangerous, she explained quickly. There was little shelter, and flash floods could sweep through the lowlands in minutes. They needed to find higher ground and protection immediately. As they ran together through the increasingly wild wind, they heard it, a cry for help, almost lost in the howling air. Whiskers skidded to a stop. It was Clover's voice. Sage grabbed Whiskers by the scruff, trying to pull him toward safety, but Whiskers planted his paws firmly in the ground. The old Whiskers would have run, would have chosen his own safety without hesitation, but he was not that cat anymore. He pulled free from Sage and ran toward Clover's voice. Sage hesitated only a moment before following him, cursing his foolishness, but unable to abandon him. They found Clover trapped in a narrow gully, the water already rising around her. She had been trying to gather herbs for her grandfather's arthritis when the storm hit. Now the flash flood was coming, and she could not climb the slippery sides. Without thinking, Whiskers jumped down into the gully. The water was shockingly cold and rising fast. He pushed Clover toward Sage, who had positioned herself at the lowest point of the gully's edge. Together, working with a coordination born of shared purpose, they managed to push Clover up to where she could scramble to safety. But now Whiskers was trapped. The water was at his chest, pulling at him with insistent fingers. His legs were growing numb from the cold. He could see the main flood coming in the distance, a wall of water and debris. Sage did not hesitate. She lay flat on the edge, extending her body as far as she could. Whiskers stretched up, his claws finding purchase in the earth, and Sage grabbed his scruff in her teeth. She pulled with all the strength of her wild-born muscles, and Whiskers scrambled with all the determination of his long journey. For a moment, it seemed impossible. The water pulling one way, Sage pulling the other, Whiskers caught between. Then Clover joined in, grabbing Whiskers' tail, which he would later admit was not the most dignified rescue, and together they hauled him up, just as the flash flood roared through the gully below. They collapsed in a heap, soaked and shaking, but alive. The storm raged around them, but they huddled together, a house cat, a wild cat, and a rabbit, finding warmth and safety in each other's presence. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling. As the sun broke through the clouds, painting rainbows across the sky, the three friends sat together on a hill overlooking the grasslands. Clover nuzzled Whiskers gratefully, and even Sage, usually so reserved, rested her head briefly on his shoulder. Whiskers felt something he had never felt before, a deep sense of belonging, not to a place, but to this moment, to these choices he had made. Sage spoke then, her voice thoughtful. She told Whiskers that what he had done in the storm, choosing to help someone at risk to himself, was the essence of what made the great predators truly great. It was not about having powerful jaws or sharp claws. It was about having the courage to use whatever power you possessed to protect rather than to dominate. She reminded him of something he had forgotten in his quest to become a lion, that courage came in all sizes. A lion's courage might look like facing down a rival to protect his pride, but a house cat's courage could look like jumping into a flooding gully to save a friend. Both were equally valid, both were equally brave. Whiskers looked out over the savannah, this place he had travelled so far to reach. He thought about the lions he had seen on television, magnificent and powerful. He understood now that he had never really wanted to be a lion. What he had wanted was to be brave. What he had wanted was to matter. And somewhere along this journey, through city streets and junkyard wisdom, through forest lessons and mountain trials, through friendship and storms, he had become exactly that. Not by changing who he was, but by discovering who he had always been beneath the fear. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Clover asked Whiskers what he would do now. Would he stay on the plains? Would he continue searching for lions? Would he try to become a wild cat like Sage? Whiskers considered this carefully. The plains were beautiful, vast and free in ways his apartment had never been. Staying here held a certain appeal, living wild, testing himself against the elements, proving his courage every single day. But as he thought about it, he realized something important. Courage did not mean constantly proving yourself. Courage did not mean choosing the hardest path simply because it was hard. Sometimes courage meant being honest about what you truly wanted, about where you truly belonged. He thought about his owner, who had probably been searching for him, worried and heartbroken. He thought about his comfortable apartment, which now seemed not like a prison, but like a home, a place where he was loved and safe. He thought about the other house cats in the neighbourhood, who he had once looked down upon for their contentment with ordinary lives. Those cats, Whiskers realised now, had their own forms of courage. There was courage in being vulnerable enough to love and be loved. There was courage in finding joy in simple things. There was courage in being gentle in a world that often valued fierceness. And there was courage in admitting that you had learned what you needed to learn, and now it was time to go home. Sage and Clover both understood. In fact, they seemed to have been expecting this decision. Sage told him that the wisest animals were those who knew when to venture out and when to return. Clover added that true courage often meant choosing love over adventure, connection over conquest. They travelled together for the first part of the journey, back through the mountains and into the forest. Along the way, they encountered other animals, and Whiskers found himself sharing the lessons he had learned. He told a young squirrel about honesty. He helped a lost bird find its way home. He stood up to a bully fox who was terrorizing a family of mice, not with violence or aggression, but with calm, firm assertion. Each act of courage was small, each one was quiet, but together they wove a pattern of kindness that rippled out across the forest, touching lives in ways Whiskers would never fully know. When they reached the forest's edge, where the trees gave way to the outskirts of the city, Sage and Clover said their goodbyes. There were no tears, only deep understanding and gratitude. They had each given the others something precious: friendship, wisdom, and the mirror in which to see their own courage reflected. Sage told Whiskers that he would always be welcome on the plains. Clover made him promise to never forget that courage came in all sizes, all species, all forms. And Whiskers promised to carry their lessons with him, to live them every day in whatever way he could. Whiskers retraced his steps through the city, which seemed both familiar and transformed. The streets that had once appeared threatening now seemed merely busy. The buildings that had felt oppressive now provided shelter from the rain. He saw the city differently because he saw himself differently. When he finally reached Maple Street, the sun was setting once again, painting the same shades of pink and gold that had witnessed the beginning of his journey. His apartment window was open. It had been open every day, his owner hoping beyond hope that her lost cat would find his way home. Whiskers paused on the sidewalk, looking up at that window. Part of him would always long for adventure, for the open grasslands and the endless sky. But he understood now that home was not a limitation. Home was a choice. Home was where you brought all that you had learned and became the best version of yourself. With a leap that felt both familiar and entirely new, Whiskers jumped from the fire escape through the open window and into his apartment. His owner's cry of joy echoed through the building. She scooped him up, tears streaming down her face, holding him close and murmuring his name over and over. Whiskers purred, a deep, rumbling purr that seemed to come from the very core of his being. Life returned to its routines, but Whiskers was not the same cat who had left. He still enjoyed sunny windowsills and afternoon naps, but now he approached them with gratitude rather than restlessness. He still watched nature documentaries, but now he saw them with different eyes that recognized courage in all its forms. The other cats in the neighborhood noticed the change. Whiskers no longer boasted or tried to prove himself. Instead, he listened. He asked questions. He showed genuine interest in their lives and their stories. When a new kitten moved into the apartment downstairs and was terrified of the world, Whiskers befriended her. He told her stories of his journey, not to brag, but to show her that fear was natural, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. When an elderly cat in the building became ill and could not reach his food bowl, Whiskers organized the other cats to take turns bringing him meals, keeping him company, making sure he was not alone. When a stray cat appeared in the alley, hungry and desperate, Whiskers convinced his owner to leave out extra food. He spent time with the stray, sharing warmth on cold nights, offering friendship without judgment. These were small acts, quiet acts. No one would make a documentary about them. No one would call him a lion for doing them. But Whiskers knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that these acts were no less courageous than facing down predators or surviving storms. One evening, many months after his return, Whiskers found himself once again pressed against the window, watching the sun set over the city. The television was playing a nature documentary, the same one that had started his journey so long ago. Lions prowled across the screen, magnificent and powerful. Whiskers watched them with appreciation, but without envy. He understood now what he had not understood before, that those lions, for all their power and glory, faced their own challenges, their own fears, their own moments of doubt. They too had to learn when to be fierce and when to be gentle. They too had to protect the vulnerable, make hard choices, balance power with responsibility. Courage, Whiskers had learned, was not a costume you put on. It was not something you became by changing your species or your size or your circumstances. Courage was a choice you made in every moment. To be kind when you could be cruel. To be honest when you could hide. To help when you could walk away. To love when you could protect yourself. He thought of Sage on the plains, living her wild life with wisdom and restraint. He thought of Clover in her warren, caring for her family with devoted attention. He thought of the Great Dane in the junkyard, choosing gentleness despite his size. He thought of Scarlet the fox, surviving through honesty and cleverness. Each of them had taught him that courage wore different faces, that bravery came in many forms, that strength was not about dominance, but about choice. The choice to use whatever power you had to make the world a little better, a little kinder, a little safer for those who needed protection. And so, dear listener, as the stars begin to emerge in the darkening sky and the world grows quiet around you, remember Whiskers and his journey. Remember that courage is not about becoming something you are not. It is about becoming more fully who you already are, the best, kindest, bravest version of yourself. Courage does not require being fierce. It does not require being the biggest or the strongest or the most powerful. Courage is in the grandmother who speaks up for what is right, even when her voice shakes. It is in the young person who admits they do not know something and asks for help. It is in the professional who stands up for a colleague being treated unfairly. It is in the friend who tells the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. Like Whiskers, you may sometimes feel small in a large world. You may look at others and think they possess some quality you lack, some magic ingredient that makes them brave while you feel afraid. But remember, the Great Dane taught kindness. The fox taught honesty, the rabbit taught community, and the wildcat taught restraint. Each creature, regardless of size or strength, had wisdom to share and courage to give. Your courage may not look like anyone else's courage, and that is exactly as it should be. The world needs people who are brave in all different ways, those who speak up and those who listen, those who lead and those who support, those who fight for justice and those who offer comfort, those who blaze new trails and those who tend to home fires. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you this truth. You do not need to become a lion to be courageous. You need only be yourself, your honest, compassionate, kind self, and make the choice, moment by moment, to use whatever power you possess to protect rather than to dominate, to build up rather than tear down, to create light rather than darkness. May you dream of golden grasslands and mountain paths, of gentle giants and wise foxes, of storms survived and friends found, and may you wake tomorrow knowing that courage lives in you, just as it always has, quiet, steady, and true as the rising sun. Sleep well, dear listener, sleep well.